Up next on Radio Dayz the Podcast.
In the early days of radio, people actually would gather around the radio and stare at it. Even though there was no picture, they would look at it like in the early days of television.
Was the beginning of using theater of the mind to create a good radio commercial, and using the right sound and the right stuff to do a really good radio commercial.
Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Radio Dayz, a podcast radio program that delves into the world of terrestrial radio. It's DJs and on-air personality, and you, all fans of radio as a medium. Here's your host, Ron.
Hello and welcome to Radio Dayz the Podcast. Not only offering this audio podcast for your enjoyment, but now you can watch this podcast via YouTube and at ronrobinsonstudios.com. On this week's episode, we're going to be taking a dive into the upcoming documentary series about the history of radio. Very cool project. In this episode, which is brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group and Radio Dayz the Movie, today we're going to discuss where the idea for Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio came from, who's in it, when and where people will be able to see it. And we're also going to play a few clips and outtakes from this docuseries. To help me do all this huge task that I'm taking on this week, I've invited an old friend of mine. As a matter of fact, he's among the over 40 people I interviewed for this docuseries. You may know him as the Paz Man. The Paz Man. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former program director of WRIF and WCSX and Detroit musician, one of the best. Please welcome Mark Pazman. How are you, sir?
Hey, Ron, how are you, bud?
I'm doing good. I really appreciate you joining me to do this special episode of Radio Dayz, man.
Exciting. You are knee deep in all my favorite stuff, so I'm more than excited to help dig in. You talk to some of my favorite peeps.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to, before we do any of that conversation, I mentioned you're a Detroit musician. You're doing a lot of things musically around Detroit. What do you got going? What's going on in the Paz Man's world in 2023?
That's kind of like why I finally got my behind out of radio, because I'd always done both pretty much from the beginning. You know, I've been a professional musician since I was 16. I played the Grandy when I was 17. But, you know, bounced back and forth between radio and different bands and had a riot doing it. So I am super blessed because I got a little taste of both worlds. And so I've always been playing. And the good thing about being a musician, other professions, except for maybe yours, Ron, is you get better at it because you do it long enough, you figure stuff out. So, yeah, I got a brand new band called Righteous Deluxe. Incredible lineup of
I love that name,
stars.
Righteous Deluxe. Righteous Deluxe, that's a bad name. I love it.
Yeah, I'm lucky to be playing with these guys. They're just Detroit's best. So we're doing that. The Pazman Super Session rolls on. I'm in year 27. I'll have to look, something like that. And I've recently been added to the Bobby Murray Orchestra. We just did an incredible concert at the Magic Bag. We're going to do some special stuff for Mardi Gras. So I'm playing my guitar all the time, Ron. I'm a happy guy.
That's what you love to do. And, this news it's fluid. So you're doing a bunch of gigs. Where can people follow you?
Well, all my stuff, because I'm an old person, is still my little Facebook page. Every year I promise to get hip and get with the new platforms or have my daughter design one for me, a website, something. But until then, Mark Passman on Facebook. Come and say hello.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I'd much rather have you have a guitar in your hand than trying to figure out new technology. No need.
Me too.
But another thing that you got coming up is, if I can ever get this ready for release, this new docuseries, Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio. You're in it, along with, as I mentioned, 40 other people like Doug Podell, Dick Purton, Fred Jacobs is in it, Chuck Santoni, Greg Russell, Greg Henson. It was just an unbelievable experience to be able to sit down with all these amazing radio broadcasters and make this series. And so, off the jump, I want to thank you for participating and being one of those great because everybody has different sense of history, and your sense of history came. And I think you appear in episode 1, but you're in a lot of episode 2 where, you're just kind of giving a brief history of where rock and roll came from. I mean, it's just, and you gave some great insight to that.
Well, thanks. And I always say I'm lucky in so many ways, but to be born when I was, I kind of missed the jazz era. Would have been nice to catch that, but I walked into the golden era of radio, which, as you know, is tied directly to the golden age of rock and classic rock and roll. And because I was able to bounce back and forth, I got to be there for some of both. And it just was an exciting time. And like any other classic period in any art form, there are the golden eras. They come, they go. Yeah. Hopefully they come back again. But, I was so lucky to be there. And, some of those folks you mentioned, I worked with a whole bunch of them, including like Fred Jacobs, who invented the classic rock format with Tom Bender. To be there is like being when Edsel Ford, figured out the Model T. So it's like a lot of it's timing, I got to say. You got to be able to, pull your own weight no matter what you do. But, man, was I lucky.
And you brought up Fred Jacobs again. He's going to be my guest on this podcast next week. We're going to talk about, do a dive into Fred Jacobs' career, which I'm sure is going to be very entertaining. Lots of stuff. That guy is just, he's done it all in radio. He's done it all in radio, and I got to say, I'm jaded. He's one of my main mentors in radio and certainly in life. So smart. I mean, you meet a lot of smart people if you're lucky as you stumble through life, but to find a smart person who's also super hip and gets it and is so attuned to what's going on, what happened in the past, but more importantly, and that's why Fred was always such a genius, what comes next. So, he was at Riff with Tom Bender and me and a bunch of great folks back in the classic AOR rock and roll radio era. That died off. And then he figured out people were walking around with little cassettes of Doors and Beatles and Zeppelins. And he said, maybe there's a format. So I got to hang out with this guy. So, once again, timing's everything. And he does, I've learned a lot from that guy. And he's in the National Radio Broadcasting Hall of Fame. Yeah. So. But he is in episode 1 where in episode 1, Mark, as you know, and I know you haven't seen the final product, but episode 1, I covered 1920 through 1960. And there's a lot of ground to cover, as it pertains to what happened in those 4 decades because, in 1920, and that's how I start the film is, I have Dick Burton and Tim Kiska debating and a little bit of Ron David debating on, what was the first radio station? What was the first radio station? Was it the station in Pittsburgh? I can't remember the call letters offhand, or WWJ. There's some discrepancies on, so that's where I start the film. But again, I go on and I talk about radio in the 30s and then in the 40s when TV came to be. But I think people are going to really find it interesting. Even people who think they know a lot about radio. Radio has evolved so many times over the years, but I'm really fascinated with those early days because they didn't know what they had. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know if it was, as Tim Kiska says, they didn't know if this was going to be a thing.
Right. Who knew? Like anything. Radio was a total unknown. And they took them a while, but they figured out what to do with it. And then I got lucky. The FM band was just sitting there. Nobody was doing anything with it, like you say. And somebody said, hey, let's try something new. So, yeah, man, radio is reinvented itself a bunch of times. And, the early days with the live show, I would give anything to have been part of that part of the radio thing where the mic goes on and there's a live orchestra and a comedian over here, the way it used to be, the golden early days of radio. That must, because you were inventing it. You were inventing an art form. So you cover a lot of really rich ground, my friend.
Before we get too ahead of ourselves into episode 2, because you're kind of delve into that episode 2 when FM became a thing, let's go ahead and play. This is a little 3 or 4 minute sizzle reel of what you can expect from episode 1 of Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio. Check this out.
But the entertaining hours of radio have not been with us always. Back in 1920, in a dimly lighted room over his garage, Dr. Frank Conrad built and operated the first experimental broadcasting transmitter.
Yeah, the big dispute between KDK in Pittsburgh and WWJ in Detroit. Both were first in a certain way. KDK usually gets the credit, though, and I think the reason is because they're 50,000 watts, and WWJ is only 5,000 watts.
In the early days of radio, people actually would gather around the radio and stare at it. Even though there was no picture, they would look at it like in the early days of television.
Was the beginning of using theater of the mind to create a good radio commercial, and using the right sound and the right stuff to do a really good radio commercial.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been informed that we have finally established communication with an eyewitness of the tragedy.
And it was a little window into how people listen to radio. They announced that it was a play. They announced it coming out of each break, and nobody paid attention, and they thought the Martians had landed, and it wreaked havoc.
When television came along, radio had to do something. And they said, well, what are we going to do? We got to be on the air. I know, let's just play music, and we'll figure it out later.
I understand Whole Lot of Shakin' sold about 1,500,000, is that right?
There's nothing like it. Memphis, people kind of forget about it. But man, the world would be an entirely different place without the music that came out of Memphis radio.
That's where the rock came from, was those records. They were all listening to the black music and the R&B stuff and the way they laid those grooves out.
I mean, the blues that came out of Sun Studios is incredible. But then Elvis came along, and all of a sudden, these Southern boys were walking in there going, well, I can do that.
Sun Studio for Memphis was the pulse during that time of music, whether it was rockabilly, the country. Memphis loved those artists who came out of there, Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis.
There is not a genre of music out there today that has not been influenced and impacted by the stuff that these guys were recording here in the 50s.
Hello, everybody. How are y'all? This is yours truly, Alan Freed. Get your dancing shoes on and welcome to the rock and roll dance party.
DJs would actually come in and kind of play what they thought their audience would like, and some of them did a very good job and developed a very big audience. But they were also susceptible to getting a little money on the side to play something that they may or may not have played if it had been strictly up to their ear.
It's funny about Phil, it wasn't illegal until they figured out what was going on. Because there was no rules on the book about could you take money to play it, because it was just commercials, right?
7 AM, 7 FMs, 5 TVs. That was it. And you couldn't own more than one station in a market. So those licenses were like diamonds. I mean, you had to protect them at all costs.
So there's a cut of what you can expect from episode 1, and again, episode 1 covers the 1920s to 1960. Episode 2 covers the 60s and 70s. Episode 3 covers the 1970s and 1980s. Probably radio's heyday if they had one. Episode 4 covers the 80s and 90s. A lot happened in those 2 decades, and then episode 5 of Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio is 2000 to current day. And we're going to touch on each of these different subjects, Mark. But again, let's delve into episode 2, because episode 2, you kind of touched on before we showed that clip from episode 1. But episode 2, I went to Memphis, and I interviewed people from WDIA, the first black radio station in the country, and I talked with several people about that era of music. And when TV went to when all the radio programs went to television, radio had to figure out how many dogs were going to bark in the backyard. Don't even worry about the magic of recording.
Cut.
I might leave some of that in. That'll be fun. Anyway, no, but to that point, it had to start somewhere, and it started with the black artist. And you mentioned a little bit ago, if I could get in a DeLorean and go back in time, I would go back and hang out with those guys, B.B. King in the younger days. Walking the Dog. I'd love to hang out with Rufus Thomas, but just. That's where it all started, and that's where rock and roll started, and it started in the South with Southern blues, and that's kind of where your expertise really kicked in a lot actually. So, what's your take on that era of music that you learned as a historian of the radio?
Well, I was lucky in that my pop. Obviously a generation behind me, but a musician himself and just amazing lover of American music. So he, I grew up listening to Lightning Hopkins and B.B. King and Rufus Thomas and all these guys before I even knew who they were. It was just music in the house. And, he'd do his best to educate me. But first time I heard that blues thing, I was hooked, and it really is the base from all American music. Whether you went bluegrass this way, you went rock and roll this way, jazz, it's all on that tree. And so I was fascinated, and so I'm sitting there in front of the Vitrola like everybody else with my album covers back in the day and trying to learn who played what. And B.B. King was a DJ too. Rufus Thomas was a DJ. So maybe that's what planted the idea in my head that you can actually play records on the radio and then at night go to the club and play your guitar. So the many ways I'm indebted to these forefathers of all American music is deeper than most. They gave me my entire life, and it didn't matter whether you lived on a farm or you lived in a city. That music goes right to your soul, and those stories are about American love, pain, up, down, whatever, and that'll morph and change over time, but that was the real stuff, and I don't know, I was just hooked, and so I kind of just fell into it naturally thanks to my dad.
With that said, here's a clip from episode 2.
The Motown ladder of leaders with number 1 from the CKLW Big 30. Diana Ross and the Supremes, Someday We're Gonna Be Together. It's 7:06 with Big Jim Edwards.
There was so much good stuff in the mid-'60s coming out of Stax Studios.
We had the Staple Singers. We had Johnny Taylor. We had Isaac Hayes. We had Sam and Dave. Otis Redding, Carla Thomas, Rufus Thomas. We had the Tim Prees. We had the Bar-Kays. And all of these people, man, that I named, every last one of them had at least a number 1 song at some point in their career, out of Stax.
People thought, hey, they're kind of like the Motown of the South, where they had so many great entertainers. I know Isaac Hayes, started there. Sam and Dave, were there. Everybody was singing "I'm a Soul Man."
Smokey Robinson of the Miracles, and we're underway for another day. It's 2 minutes after 6, WKNR time. The Big Curtain Show from now until 9.
Motown was, that really got Detroit on the map, and especially for stations like WXYZ, CKLW.
Another deadly duo of Detroit dastardly deeds as the dice decreed death, a disagreement over 7,11. Now she's in heaven.
There was a station over in Windsor called CKLW. This station was and remains a legendary radio. You could drive up and down Woodward Avenue and you could hear that station coming out of every car.
It was the right station, it was the right time, and they had all guns blazing. News, sports, weather, traffic. You couldn't beat it, and that's why it was unbeatable at the time, and that's why some stations dropped off.
From Studio D, this is J.P. McCarthy's Focus. WJR presents an active view of life and living in the Great Lakes area. A lively look at people, places, events, and attitudes put into focus by J.P. McCarthy.
So J.P. McCarthy was such a legend in Detroit, and he was on WJR in such a different time of radio than it is right now, because there wasn't any satellite radio or syndication radio either. So by being on WJR, it was a clear signal AM, which means that there isn't another 760 AM anywhere. So that station would just boom all over the Midwest and even into Florida sometimes. So he was a pretty big deal.
This is WJR, the Goodwill Station, Detroit.
Norman Cash coming to bat now, trailing 1-0 in the 6th inning with nobody on base and one man down for Detroit.
To me, the king of the guy that making you feel at ease and making you feel like you knew him was Ernie Harwell. I mean, it was the soundtrack of my youth.
I didn't even need the video when Ernie was on the radio because he just explained things when he was talking. I close my eyes and I feel like I was at the ballpark.
Ernie was a guy that not only did he paint a picture in baseball, but Ernie went out of his way to bring up the next generation. You can't talk to a guy that's doing radio in Detroit who has not been touched by Ernie Harwell.
I think personally Ernie is the greatest guy, broadcaster / everything put together that I ever knew. What a gentleman, what a talent, what an incredible voice, what a human being. He was everything. He was the best of everything. I don't know, you could be better in any way than Ernie Harwell.
So there it is. That's the clip from sizzle reel, if you will, from episode 2 of Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio. Now, episode 3, Mark, this is when we're talking about the 70s and 80s. Now, we start the decade, where FM is really cock of the walk now. FM, as you mentioned earlier, was just that band that no one really wanted to do anything with. You guys, here's these long-haired hippies, you can do what you want with it. And they played, because before that, it was beautiful music. It was jazz. It was just things you would hear on an elevator. Right. What they called beautiful music. Right. And then the 70s came and man, people started become identifying with these radio disc jockeys, and that changed radio.
Oh yeah.
70s set the foundation for what was going to happen in the next 3 or 4 decades.
Right. And from the Detroit perspective, we had a few TV stars, news guys and stuff, Bill Bonds, etc. But, during that era, the rock stars, the big personalities in this town were Arthur Penhallow, Doug Podell. They were the guys on the radio. And people wanted to be friends and hang out and go to the show where you were going to go. And, it was... like I said, I was super lucky to, be thrown in this mix with all these incredible people at this incredible time. And then you had, rock music at, its commercial peak, if nothing else. But with all good things comes money, and with money comes a lot more guys in suits coming around going, hey, I actually had a consultant, Ron. Now, those of you in Detroit know Arthur Penhallow, biggest rock star. His slogan was "Baby." Baby. 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 Probably have that somewhere. Anyway, this consultant came to town and told me to tell Arthur to stop saying "baby." Baby. Now, he lived in New York, and this is before the days where everybody could hear everybody. He didn't understand what was going on in Detroit. So anyway, my point is that the suits invaded, and that was inevitable because when there's money to be made, that's what happens. And I'm not saying we didn't make great radio after the suits arrived, because we sure did, because they figured out some cool ways to get our clients' money to do really great stuff, not only for our clients but for our audience. We had free concerts at Hart Plaza when nobody was doing anything. You know, it goes back to the days of the hayride back in the South, right? Nothing's really new. You just reinvent it. Anyway, that era was just nuts because the disc jockeys were stars and the bands were Journey and the Stones. I mean, it was insane. Once again, lucky pass man be thrown in the middle of that mix.
You know, you brought it up, and this is something that comes up in episode 3 is the rock wars that were going on between WRAF and WLLZ and 98.7. Well, 98.7 was LLZ, but then you also had ABX and W4 before they went country. There was it wasn't. It started out a little bit rough. There was some animosity, but when people started jumping around here, jumping around there, but you were knee deep in that. But you brought up Journey. Journey spent like an entire summer here, if I'm not mistaken, playing softball with all of you guys. I do talk about this in the Docuseries, but maybe you could share with us, a synopsis of that time.
Well, Journey's and Riff is a very good example of two parties who figured out that they could do a lot for each other, and I think artist relationships with radio has always been important, but like everything else in that era, we figured out how to grow it, how to expand it. So instead of just Journey coming by and doing a quick interview in the afternoon, like you say, we'd have them in for a week. They'd sit in on the morning show for a week. We'd have a softball game where everybody all the fans could come and see their rock stars try and play baseball, or Steve Perry refusing to eat a hot dog because he was vegan even then. But yeah, it was a nutty time, and we mentioned Arthur Penhall earlier and Ken Calvert, two of my heroes from the day. Their relationships with that band, because Kenny used to work for CBS Radio, and therefore he knew the band before he got here, and I think he helped bring the relationship, to the radio station, and they loved Arthur, who didn't. So yeah, they'd come and they hang out. I remember Billy Squire was in town one night, and he came in my office just to hide from his drummer because he was so sick of his drummer. He said, "Can I just hide in your office so I don't have to be around my drummer?" So yeah, that was a cool part of the era.
Here's a clip from episode 3 of Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio.
Yes, that's Fred Neil from an album called Sessions, and Roll On Rosie. Is that nifty? Yeah, it certainly is. Let's see, going back to 9:30, we heard the Beatles and then the Bob Seger System.
1970 radio FM is emerging. It had been around from a technical point of view since the late 40s, but for most of the 50s and the first part of the 60s, FM radio was either what we called beautiful music, the kind of station you would hear in an elevator or a dentist's office, and jazz, and classical. So the fringe formats.
And it was a rebel factor because my mom and dad did not want to hear about that. They didn't want FM. Like, what are you listening to, Brian? Well, it's not CKLW, Brian. No, it's not, Mom, but it's really good. You should check it out. Yeah, okay, whatever. You should put Frank Sinatra back on.
Times are starting to change. Guys like Jim Johnson, who did afternoons at W4, had much more energy, much more electricity. Guys like Steve Dahl, who didn't have a deep radio voice, He wasn't laid back in the morning. He was wild, crazy, and just had his own regular high-pitched voice.
Well, listen, we took all the disco records that you brought tonight. We got them in a giant box, and we're going to blow them up real good.
Thank goodness for Steve Dahl. I was a card-carrying member. Remember the cards that you had to have that were like anti-disco cards? And I had one of those, and I was proud of it.
And I think that Riff really took advantage of that with JJ and the Morning Crew, and they came out with something called the Dread card. And Dread was an acronym for Detroit Rockers Engaged in the Abolition of Disco.
Disco happened mostly because of one radio station in New York by the name of WKTU. They scored an 11 share in the ratings. Now in New York, if you have a 2 share or a 3 share in the ratings, you're very successful. This station had an 11 point something, okay? Well, that made headlines throughout the industry.
The radio sees a fad, corporate radio, they're all in. And so all these stations flipped, and you know, a lot of us rock people, we were not too excited about it.
Currently in Detroit, it's 70 degrees. This is the Riff, WRIF, R's the P, rocking with the top.
Personalities mattered to fans of Detroit radio, and if they said they were going to be making an appearance at a particular club or bar or whatever the case may be, people showed up to hang out with them and to see them. I mean, a lot of stations made a lot of money on music personalities.
Hello again, and welcome to American Top 40. I'm Casey Kasem, and I'm all set to count down the 40 best-selling songs in the USA this week, according to the Billboard National Chart.
Number 40. Casey Kasem, the delivery, it was just different than everyone else at the time, and it's the only way, and it mattered. Back in the day, it's the only way you knew if a record was number 1 or not. You had to listen to Casey Kasem.
So that's episode 3 there. Episode 4, as I mentioned, covers the 80s and 90s. Whatever was happening in the 70s and 80s, they kind of perfected it in the 80s and 90s. In 80s and 90s, you had MTV coming on the scene, competing with terrestrial radio. You had all that great music that was coming out of Los Angeles and New York, even in the 80s. Actually, all over the place. Music was coming from everywhere. All kind of different genres were playing on pop radio. You also had the we were talking about Fred Jacobs earlier. That's when Fred Jacobs went out on his own and with his brothers, started the whole classic rock thing with Tom Bender, the classic rock format. A lot of people don't know Fred Jacobs. That was he was responsible for that. So a lot of things happened in the 80s, and then in the 90s you had grunge, which I'm sure we will be discussing. But you were in radio in the 80s and 90s. What was it like from the inside in Detroit radio?
Confusing for some of my brothers in the rock world. So it was a fun time, but confusing time for some of my fellow rock programmers who couldn't figure out, what to do with some of this music, and they had, let's just say, a somewhat limited parameter of, from the Stones to Judas Priest, and if you were outside that, and that kept shrinking as we went along. So, my very first job at the old radio station was to teach people about new wave and punk and stuff, which was coming in. And the radio programmers didn't know it, especially in the middle of the country, didn't know what to do with it. Can you play a Ramones record after a Zeppelin record? Can you believe anybody ever asked that question? One of the reasons I got out of radio. So, really, real fun time, and MTV, game changer. I mean, for radio, for rock and roll, visuals were always important, but now they were maybe more important than the audio. And so that changes everything. So prettier bands got hired than uglier bands. And then you have the reaction, like you mentioned, the grunge thing, where they just said, we're going to stare at our shoes and play loud, nasty guitars. If you don't like it, you can kiss off. So, crazy time. I loved it because I love all the flavors. Absolutely.
Right. Well, Yeah, I don't want to go back into episode 3, but you weren't too crazy about disco, if I remember.
Well, that's a personal issue. It took away all my rooms went from hard rock to disco, and my band couldn't work. So I had a bit of a problem with spoom, spoom, spoom. Yeah, just a little.
Yeah, you can find out more about the disco era in episode 3. So, as far as episode 4 goes, as we mentioned, that that was the era of MTV coming along, and I think you mentioned in the series that beforehand, people were saying, "Hey, did you listen to Arthur last night?" And now people were like, "Hey, did you see you on MTV last night?" It became. I don't think video killed the radio star, but it definitely woke radio up a little bit, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely. And that was the beginning of radio not being able to figure out how to coexist with that, and then later internet and everything that was to come. Double-edged sword. These videos are a great way to promote the music that you were playing. Is another way to find new records to play without having to play a record that nobody heard of, because MTV was doing so much of the work. But like I say, double-edged sword. People started to turn to them for music, not so much for us. And so, like most businesses, when they are threatened, they tighten things up, and things got tighter and tighter in radio. And before you know it, the rock stations were down to, a handful of songs repeated over and over again. And then radio started to become less popular, and they couldn't figure out why, Ron. They couldn't figure it out.
And the big name personalities were getting paid. And here's a clip from episode 4 where we delve into that paradigm that is radio in the 80s and 90s.
The Motor City's fresh choice. More music, more money. Power 96 FM has cornered the market on instant gratification. We didn't invent foreplay. We just perfected it.
Oh, that sounds good to me.
What's that?
Well, in the early 80s, top 40 radio was starting to decline. We saw a lot of radio stations that were top 40 dynasties disappear. Stations like WABC in New York, WLS in Chicago was one of the last to go down, KFRC in San Francisco, KHJ in Los Angeles, CKLW, Windsor, Ontario / Detroit. These were all big radio stations that had a national presence all across the country that were all failing because AM radio was failing.
I guess if there's a difference, because there were only 5 major AM stations back when AM was big, and there might be 20 FM major signals when FM was big, that radio stations could be more narrowly focused in their format.
In the 1980s, that's when this whole new thing called adult contemporary came out. Now that's where it would be music that was for a younger listening audience, but it wasn't rock music, but then again, it wasn't Mantovani music. But it was, just kind of like this thing that was a little bit more so on the middle part where you can listen to it and enjoy it. I mean, stuff by people like Lionel Richie.
There was so much great music coming out in the 80s, and it was just one after another, that there was so much enthusiasm for that music that the listeners couldn't get enough of it. So they were listening to the radio at all times because they just wanted to consume more 80s, more Hairspray,
The 80s, I think hair bands. The minute I think the 80s, I think Def Leppard and Bon Jovi and Poison and all those bands, and how much we all loved them with our, our big hair. That's what I think of.
What was happening in the 80s was that there was this influx of new bands, but there was also the bands that were established were getting better. Recordings were getting better. Tours were better.
You hear me roll Nobody But Me by George Thorogood. You want to be caller number 20 at 298-6360, and you'll pick up a pair of tickets.
It's hard to talk about radio in the 80s without thinking about MTV, which signed on in the early 80s and really changed the game for all of us in radio. I mean, first by the visuals that started coming with songs. I mean, in the past, and you go back to your Orson Welles example where radio painted pictures, all of a sudden now we have videos.
all the energy towards new music is not on radio anymore. It's like, did you hear so-and-so on MTV last night? You started to hear that more than, did you hear so-and-so on Arthur's show last night? Because radio was going away from doing something different, and MTV was going, woo, look at this great, crazy stuff, and we're putting it in your living rooms.
We had to come up with creative ways of presenting new music to our listeners. So we'd do stuff like Make It or Break It, where you would play a brand new song by a band and say, do you like it or not? And people would call in and tell you and get the instant feedback on the song. And brand new bands that were trying to break into the industry. That was a really cool way to see if people were picking up on what they were laying down.
And the contests were really good, and listeners, I know it's really mind-boggling when you think how it's so different now, but how the participation was so great. And the phones were such a dynamic entity that you even had to have someone there to help you with the phones. So the contests were huge. The listener interaction was huge. Teasing was huge. Putting some of the listeners on and then not getting the right one was huge. People would do scavenger hunts to find stuff.
Mary Young is with us again to talk about the discrepancy now between the number of fires the fire department says happened and the number the mayor's office says were set on Halloween and Devil's Night.
You know, Dick, I think the damn media is making too much out of this minor
discrepancy, sir? Discrepancy?
Yeah, that's right.
Why is that?
Well, what's a few fires between friends?
Well, in the 80s, though, we had great talent in Detroit. I mean, not just Detroit, but around the country. But they were investing in talent. I mean, guys were making good money, and they were superstars. Dick Burton was huge. JP was huge.
How could you not be a fan of the impact that people like that made, that the Electrifying Mojo made, that Lisa made? It was, again, you know, Alan Allman's another one.
This is 100.3 WNIC, Detroit's nicest rock. Alan Allman, until midnight tonight.
Ken Calvert, Karen Savelli, Doug Podell, Steve Costan, Uncle Buck, and me, John O'Leary, the Classic Jocks on CSX.
You know, back then, those people, those were stars, and they were paid generously, and they had one job, and that was to be a DJ on the radio and entertain people and get information across to these people for 4 to 6 hours a day. That was their only job.
And we talked to another man who said that he was looking for someone to make the page, so apparently it's you.
Okay.
It's Belfer Blows.
Belfer Blows?
Yes.
Mr. Belfer Blows.
Yes. He just paged me, and apparently it might be time for my dialysis. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay, let me see if I can locate him then.
No, please page.
Page him?
Yeah, you can page him.
Definitely.
He's expecting a page.
Oh, the gluttony of it all, you know? It was just so, everything was easy. Promotions. There was money for promotions. There was money for, as you said, for salaries. There was money for giveaways. You know, those were the days of, you know, lots of budget and excess in the business. And it wasn't a bad thing because it was, I agree with you. I think that the 90s were a pretty good time to be in radio in terms of a business.
So there you go. You mentioned it before, Mark, before we introduced the episode 4 section there about Suits coming in. That was the genesis of what became a reality for a lot of different radio stations. Well, pretty much every radio station from 2000 on. The digital age was upon us, and so it was a perfect storm of the digital age making radio a different, things being run differently than it was in the past when it was pre-digital, and then the combination of that and people coming in and spending millions of dollars on these radio stations and owning multiple, hundreds, in some cases thousands of radio stations. The writing was on the wall that radio as we knew it wasn't going to be for much longer.
Yeah, they never figured out, and I'll be the first one to say I have no idea what the answer would have been. But they had no idea, and no offense to any of the real smart people still making radio, many of which I know. never really kind of figured out what to do with the internet and the digital revolution. You know, I can remember some staff meetings where the suits were going, oh, we just ignore it and we're always, music is going to be here and blah, blah, blah. They'll do the news reports or whatever. And then, you know, a month later, I'd be at the same meeting and they're going, well, the internet's here to stay, so we got to incorporate it. So we want you to get over on Twitter and ditter and bitter and butter. So, I mean, they really, I don't think, ever figured out what to do, how to coexist. And the only thing I'm sure of is that when you have people walking around, and I grab my phone, but I'm using it for this very experience, but they have their phone in their pocket with hundreds of their favorite songs and probably a list of their top whatever. They don't need everybody else on radio doing that. I mean, it just seems, I understand why you want to play popular music, and I get the whole thing. I did it for many, many years, but it always seemed weird to me that they couldn't figure out that if somebody else is doing exactly what you do and they have it in their pocket, plus you've stripped away all the entertainment, you know, the disc jockeys, the banter, the this, that, and the other, the fun and creative stuff. If you shove that down into, hey, did you see on Facebook today this lady beat this other lady with a frozen turkey? You know, it's not entertaining. It's not radio. Why would they come to you if they got that in their pocket? You know, so we have to account for that as an industry. You know, I'm not saying there's not room for a top 20 radio stations. They just don't need all to be top 20 radio stations.
But it wasn't just the money, to be fair, because the digital age changed the way that radio is made. And because it is digital, it doesn't require the manpower. Like, for example, pre-digital, you had to have somebody in that studio turning those records back in the day. That person had to be paid. But when digital came, I'm not saying rightfully so, but it justified, well, I don't need 20 people. I can do it.
And I don't need, right.
And
I don't need this big fancy studio. I can do it with this, that, and the other.
Right.
I guess my most vivid story of that whole thing was, so I did the blues show for 26 years at WCSX Sunday nights. And as time went on, they tried different things after my show, but it eventually ended up being put on digital. So my job, one of my jobs after I was done, instead of call, hey, how you doing? Hey, what do you got coming up on the show? Okay, I'll be listening. You don't do that. You sign off and you push a button. And you walk across the room and you turn off the lights. And you walk out of the studio and digital stuff plays. The first time this happened, I had to do this. I stood there, I don't know for how long, because maybe it's because I used to be a program director responsible for the entire radio station, but I go, I'm leaving this magnificent tool running, this voice that reaches out to everybody's car and everybody's home. There's nobody home. There's nobody there. It's just a button and a bunch of, electronic parts. I couldn't leave. The wife calls me, honey, how come you're not home? I says, I can't leave this. I couldn't leave, Ron. It took me a while to just shut the door and walk out to my car. It didn't feel right, man. It didn't feel right.
Without further ado, let's play a clip from episode 5. And again, radio was different, and I think I portrayed that pretty good in this clip. Check it out.
Q Country 107. I wonder if there's anywhere you can take that Give a Damn. Do you have a receipt? Can you take it back to the Give a Damn store? Probably not. Rod Robinson here on Q Country 107 with your notes from Nashville for today.
country radio was doing pretty well in the 2000s. That's what I remember. And hosting a country radio morning show, it was pretty successful because that format tends to go up and down musically. And right at that moment, at least during that decade, it was pretty much at another one of its peaks.
There were different periods of time. There were the morning show wars, and I was in the Clear Channel cluster where it was, Mojo taking on Jay Towers, so you had that going on. There was the sports radio wars where, for 3 or 4 years, no matter what 1270 did, they couldn't get us.
The great Wojo Damas returns with his partner Stoney on Wednesday. See if his prediction comes true.
I see Andre Ware in the Hall of Fame, too.
Radio in the 2000s, again, it's connected to the music that was coming out in a lot of regards. The business of radio was changing dramatically, in which big clusters of radio stations began to form where these giant media companies would buy multiple stations in a marketplace.
I think it started to weaken a little bit in the 2000s. Before the 2000s, before the 90s, you had strong personalities who were getting paid 7 figures. That was done.
Drew and Mike were the penultimate example. There was a successful, big advertising bucks being poured into it, highly profitable radio show. And while it's at its strength and while it's at its peak, corporate ownership decides to pass on their next contract and bring in a completely different morning team.
But we'll leave you there, gratuitous rock star. Thank you forever to hold you until the next time. Are you ready?
Ready. Thank you, Detroit.
What really hurt was digital. When you could stream any station, when you could take your ad dollars. Radio was always the little brother to TV. Like TV revenue was off the charts. Car dealers had to be on TV. Some of them would be on radio, but not all. When digital came, all that money just went to the four winds.
When conglomerates bought up stations, and with all this new technology, one of the things that I hated that it eliminated personalities. A lot of people were laid off their jobs.
So to see those people get axed, and it's not that they did anything wrong, and it wasn't even their bosses making the decisions. It was something coming from a much higher up, out-of-state office. That was really difficult. And then what made it even worse was when you would get the news that this person was axed and now you're also responsible for their job as well. That was brutal.
It just became more prevalent that it was just all about money, and the restrictions came in, and 20-second breaks. A light would come on at 20 seconds, whereas before they let us have our own good judgment on what to do.
That has to do, I think, with the executives at radio. They were only going by what they thought was a research that they were doing. When you do research, like political research, music research, you don't talk to everybody. You talk to a small group of people. And they were saying that people don't want to hear all this stuff, they just want to hear the music. And that's not true.
There was a time when programming ruled. What programming said went. I think today, in a lot of ways, sales rules radio today.
Cancellations or delays at Detroit Metro Airport, and standing by, here's WJR's John Stockwell.
Hello, Michael. Right now, I'm standing outside the Northwest Terminal, where about 50 Northwest employees and pilots are walking the picket line in response to the current labor dispute at Northwest.
I think people can be optimistic about the future of radio because it still is always evolving. Because let's face it, the big time of radio to an extent was the music of like the 60s going into the 70s. But if they hadn't evolved into what was going on in the next decade and the next generation, it would have been gone a long time ago. But radio's still here. They will still always figure out a way to be here.
Radio and mass communication can play a big part in this if they do it correctly. And people are still attached to the radio, but not the same way. And it's radio's job to turn this back around during this decade of the 2020s, if you will.
But I think you got to be local and immediate. So if something's going down in your town, you better be able to talk about it. right now.
And that's why you have Dave and Chuck are so popular, because they are so uber local. They're very entertaining to listen to, and people feel like it's like their friend that they're listening to and they're having fun with.
Where are you going to go during a storm? Where are you going to go during a national disaster? All of those things. And where are you going to go for some humor, some information, other than radio? Radio is still the most intimate medium there is, period.
All right, there you have it. That's episode. We've played little sizzle reels from all 5 episodes. Mark, I will tell you this: I get a lot of questions. When are we going to see this? Where are we going to see this? And well, I got to be honest. I mean, when I think about the fact that I did the first interview for this series before I knew it was a series. When I started shooting for it, I thought it was going to be a movie, a documentary movie, and I didn't even know the genesis of it was I wanted to make a documentary movie about what happened to the rock and roll DJ. You know, why wasn't the rock and roll DJ popular like they were, when I was coming up? And it has evolved. And like I mentioned, 2014 was my first interview, and it was a guy with got the name of Dick Kernan, who I think you're very familiar with. We both love that man. He was the first person I interviewed for this, and I think the second one was Art Volo. So right off the jump, I got 2 very knowledgeable folks about the history of radio, and then I was off to the races. And so it wasn't until, I want to say, right before COVID hit. Well, maybe 18, 19, so maybe a year or 2 before COVID, when I really had found direction with this. And at that point, I was still going to make it a movie, but as I've gone on and interviewed many, many people, 40 people to be exact, it's gone. There's just too much. There's just too much. I mean, I've done in some cases 2-hour-long interviews with about 40 people, including Art Regner, Terry Foster, Brian Pastoria, Karen D'Alessandro, guy by the name of Mark Pasman, JoJo Shuddy McGregor, Jim Edwards, Buzz Van Houten, Doug Podell, Greg Henson, Mike Staff, Bev Johnson, Jill Forsyth, Dick Purton, Chuck Santoni, Renee Vitale, Michelle McCormick, Fred Jacobs, Dick Kernan, Art Volo, and of course, last but certainly not least, a guy by the name of Paul W. Smith. By the
my
way.
life is flashing before my eyes.
It's turned into a 5-part docuseries. And so my last interview I did was with my last 2 interviews were with Greg Russell and Ken Calvert. Ken Calvert's in this series as well.
Yeah, man.
There's another name.
Both of those
What
guys.
a great man,
Yeah.
Ken Calvert. But those were the last 2. And so pretty much all last summer up until now, I've been editing this 30-hour. I mean, I have like 34 hours of content that's not being used. It's ridiculous how much content has been pushed to the side. But at the end, there's still 5 hours long. No one's going to go sit in a theater for 5 hours. So Brian Pastoria is actually the one that said, hey, make this, it's 2023. Everybody watch this series. It's binge watched. So it seemed like a natural fit. Now, there's also been people asking me, hey, are you going to take this 5 hours and make it into 90 minutes?
I know.
I want to choke those people out. I'm telling you right now. I have put so much time and effort into this series, and I love how it's turned out. But to answer the question we started with before I went off on that long tangent, is where I'm at now is I'm negotiating to find out how much it's going to cost to use some of the pictures and music that I'm using in this 5-part series. That's where I'm at now. Once that's complete, which I expect it to be wrapped up here in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, then it's just a matter of finding, 2 or 3 streaming services where people can go and watch us. But I'm also going to be hitting up local Detroit stations in the market because, this is a history lesson about it is a movie about it is a series about the history of radio, but it feels very Detroit centric. And so I'm very excited for people to see it. And I looks like I lost Mark. I think I lost Mark. So again, if you want to get the latest on where I am in this docuseries and when and where it will be shown, because that's not an answer that I can give you right now. But if you want to follow me, just keep following this podcast. I'll be giving you updates as they become available. But we're very, very close to getting this ready for public consumption. Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio, a 5-part docuseries. about the history of radio, the history of Detroit radio, and I think a lot of people are really, really going to enjoy watching this film. And if you want to learn more or see a couple trailers for this docuseries, go over to ronrobinson.com and click the Radio Dayz the Movie tab at the top under documentaries, and there's a bunch of videos and outtakes that I've published in preparation for this docuseries. So thank you for tuning in today. Mark, I want to thank you for coming on to help me with this episode. I think we lost Mark. Thank you, Mark. Thanks again to Mark Pasman, and thank you for tuning in to Radio Dayz the Podcast. Today's show is brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage. Today's show was brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group. First-time home buyers get up to $10K to use for a down payment. Call Brian at 810-444-6466, 810-444-6466. Today's show is produced by Ron Robinson Studios. If you need professional marketing videos or professional photography headshots, maybe you need drone video or photography, head over to ronrobinsonstudios.com. You can also hear previous episodes of Radio Dayz, the podcast, there as well. Also, as I mentioned, if you'd like to learn more about the upcoming docuseries about the history of radio, run Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio. Click on the Radio, the Movie tab under the documentaries at ronrobinsonstudios.com. Thanks for checking out the show. Thanks again for listening. And thank you to Mark Pasman for making this a little bit easier on me today. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.
You can't go. All the plants are going to die.